Dr. Hedem, we are at the Mishnah on the top of Daf Nun Gimel Aleph, Ketzad Mevatla. But before we start, thank you so much for the coffee. Such a wonderful thing. Ketzad Mevatla. How would a goy only be Mevatla and avoid Zara? Zogt the Mishnah some suggestions. Either Kata Rosh Oizno, if he cut off the tip of the ear of the Avodah Zarah, or Rosh Chaytma, the tip of the nose, or Rosh Etzba, a finger. Pichza, Rashi says, Miacha b'kornish, smashed with a hammer, so the body is somewhat crushed, but still complete. Alpha pi shaloi chisra, even though it's not missing any parts, bitla, it's still bottom. Let's peek into the Bach. Ois beis. Rokak b'fanel, so that adds a kuf there. Rokak b'fanel, if you spit in front of, you spit onto the Avodah Zarah, or hishtin b'fanel, or the guy urinated there. Garura, he dragged it in a non-respectful way, he gets it full of mud. Or zark basat tzoya, he threw tzoya at it. Harezu einu b'tei. That would not be mevatlet. Why? Because we could say that the guy has a love-hate relationship with his getchka. As Rashi says, yeah, now he's upset at him, but they'll kiss and make up later. Of course, because a yid cannot be mevatla. What happens if machra or mishkana? What if the guy sold the avodah zarah? That seems to be literally selling it out. Or if he owed money and he gave it as a mashkin. Rabbi Omer Bitel, Rabbi said that's an act of defiance and that's mevatla avodah zarah. That would not be mevatla avodah zarah. Even if you didn't miss anything, thank you very much. Even if you didn't miss anything, in other words, going back to the case of pichsa, where you smashed it with a hammer and got mushy maybe, but there's no pieces missing. If there's no pieces missing, but my bitla, how is that mevatel avodah zarah? Amar b'zeira shepichsa b'fanel. Where did you do this? On the face of the avodah zarah. And Rashi says v'kilkel tzurasa. That's already mekalkel that degrades the tzura of the avodah zarah, the form of the avodah zarah, since it's in the face of the avodah zarah, and therefore that's considered avodah. Zogt gemara weiter. Rokak b'fanel, v'hishtin b'fanel, minu hanamili. How do you know that these are things that, although they show a temporary anger, but it doesn't mean that the goy is completely abandoning his avodah zarah? The Chizkiah and Avi is talking about how Oivdei Avodah Zarah, the patterns of Oivdei Avodah Zarah, the psychology of an Oivdei Avodah Zarah. When he'll be hungry, in other words, his getchka is not delivering. V'yiskatzev, he'll be angry at his getchka. V'kilel b'molchai uve'eloi hov, and he will curse his king and his god, his getchkala. And who will he turn to? Ufana l'mayla. It ofams and hence him tatin hemel. He realizes that the Rebbeinu Shem is the ikr and damage to the Rebbeinu Shem. So you think that he was healed from his machla of avodah zarah. Uksiv basrei, and right after that it says in the pasuk, "Vel eretz yabit." Eventually he's going to go back down to the ground and look back to his avodah zarah in the tzara v'chashech. The avagav the kilel malkoi ve'lehav upana l'mayla. Even though he cursed his getchke and he turned to Hashem, even he realizes that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the only person that we can turn to. Nevertheless, El Eretz Yabit, he will always relapse and go back to the Avodah Zarah. So the point is, yes, the guy might be temporarily angry at the Getchka because the Getchka didn't deliver his current needs, but he'll eventually go back to his Getchka. Machra Oibishkin, Rabbi Omer Bital. We have a machlokes if selling a Getchka or if giving it to a creditor as a mashkin, as a collateral, does that indicate a bittul of the avodah zarah? So this leads us into a somewhat complex discussion. Zeiri Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the Mandamar number 1, Rabbi Yehuda Abba Amar Rav, Mandamar number 2. Chad Amar, one of these two Amiroyim said, Machlokes b'tzarif ovid kacham. Where are they arguing? Where does Rebbe and the Chabam argue whether or not selling it to a goy or be mamashka to a goy is a bittel or not, where Rebbe says bitel, so that would be a kula, the chamam loy bitel, which would be a chumrah, that to be sold it to a tzarif goy. Now, when we talk about buying metals, because it seems to be talking about a metal, Avoda Zara, so we use the lashon tzarif. Technically, you could sell it to anybody, but the Gemara is using the lashon of tzarif, meaning somebody who's a silversmith or whatever metal smith it is that we're dealing with. So the assumption is that he's going to melt it down and make something out of it. So the machlok is whether or not it's considered a bittul as if he sold it to a goy. But if he sold it to a yid, divrei hakoil bitel. There, everybody would be moide. Everyone would be moide to Rav that you mevatlet, because when the goy sells it to a yid, he knows that there's no way this getch is going to survive. The yid's surely not going to use it as an avodah zara. But for a goy, there is a possibility that the goy is going to use it for an avodah zara. As Rashi says, "B'tzaref oived lechavim, shemachra oived lechavim, l'tzaref chavera." He sold it to another person who deals in scrap metal. Hasam ka'ami rabbanan d'lebitla. Only there are the rabbanan machmir and say that the sale of a getchke does not constitute a bittul. The sover hamoicher, the moicher thinks, given l'kech so oived lechavimu, since the buyer is also a goy, is someone who's oived avodah zara, palachla. He's not going to melt it down and break it apart. He's going to serve my getchke. So therefore, when he's selling it, he's not being mevatlet. But if you sold it to a yid, mistama botla midate, for sure, the likelihood is that the guy was mevatl the getchke before he sold it to the yid, because the assumption is that made the other the high taverla. The yid's not going to keep it as an avodah zara. That was one shot in the machlokes. So the machlokes is only by moichel l'tzarif Yisrael. I'm sorry, the machlokes is only by moichel l'tzarif Nochri. The Chad Amar b'tzarif Yisrael machlokes. There's a machlokes by tzarif Yisrael, meaning it's possible that when he's selling it to the yid, he's also not mevatl. What is the deal with tzarif Nochri? In other words, this other shita that says they're arguing by tzarif Yisrael, does that mean kula al mamoida by tzarif Nochri? It would not be batal, or maybe it's also by tzarif Yisrael. And no matter who the guy sells it to, there's a machlokes between Rebbe and the Tanakama, not Tanakama, Tanabasra, as to whether or not this getchke is batal. So that's exactly the shayla of the Gemara. Ibailu b'tzarif Yisrael machlokes avol tzarif oived kichavim divra kar lebitel. The second shita holds that if he sells it to a goy, for sure he's not mevatel avodah zara, because he for sure assumes that the buyer is going to keep it as a getchke. But only to a yid is he concerned that maybe the yid won't sell to a getchke, and only there does Rebbe hold bitel and the chachamim holds loy bitel. Oidilma bein bozeh ubein bozeh machlokes. Maybe the machlokes is sai if it was sold to a yid and sai if it was sold to a goy. Toshma, let's see if we could bring a raya. The Omar Rebbe said, Nirin devarai, I hold like me that the getchke is bottle, kishamochra lechavla, if he sold it for destruction. So if he's selling it for destruction, surely he's mevatlet, because he knows it's going to be destroyed. But I believe that it's more mistaber to paskin that loy bitel, like the chachamim, if it's shamochra lo'ivdel. If I sold it, if the guy sold it with the express intent that the buyer was planning to serve it as an avodah. That's the poshet ataych of this brisa. But the Gemara is going to dissect it and say that the way I taiched it is completely wrong. My lechavlo umay lo'ivda. Ilem lechavlo lechavlo mamish. Lo'ivda lo'ivda mamish. Like I just explained, well, in my timer, demand amar bitel, umay timer, demand amar loy bitel. If he sold it lechavlo mamish, how could the Rabbanan say loy bitel? He's selling it to destruction. That's for sure mevutel. And if he sold it with the express intention of lo'ivda, how could Rebbe hold that that's called bittel? So that cannot be the discussion. Ella lav lechavlo means lemisha osid lechavlo. When the Brisa says, when Rebbe said nirin devarai kishamocher lechavlo, that means the pashut is that it's bottled if you sold it to a person who the assumption is that he's planning to destroy it. And who is that? Who is a person that would buy a getchke and it would be quite clear that his intention is to destroy it and to melt it down, umanu tzarif Yisrael. And when it says lo oivda, l'misha asid lo oivda, umanu tzarif oivd kacham. So now that we understand what this means, let's go read the Lashon HaBrais again and see if we can understand what it's saying. The Amar Rebbe said, Nirin Divarai, I believe I'm right, Kishemachra Lachav. If you sold it to a Yid. If you sold it to a Yid, I think I'm right. Which is mashma that we're arguing, say if I sold it to a Yid, say if I sold it to a Goy. But I think I'm right. It's more mistaber to paskin like me that it's the Avodah Zarah's bottle if you sold it to a Yid. And it's more mistaber to paskin like the Chachamim who holds it's not bottle is if it's shamach loivda if you sold it to a Goy who will likely be over it. So based on that interpretation, it's clear that the Rebbe and the Chachamim are arguing. Say if it was sold to a Yid, say if it was sold to a Goy. Rebbe holds no matter what, it's bottle. The Chachamim holds no matter what, it's not bottle. And the Rebbe is commenting that it's more mistaber to say like me when you sell to a Yid, and it's more mistaber to say like the Chachamim when you sell to a Goy. Zok to Gemara. Zok to Gemara, Ushmamina. So what do you see from the way we just read this Gemara? Bein Bazeh, Uvein Bazeh, Machloikes. Let's see what the Bach says in Gimel. Bein Bezu, Uvein Bezu, Machloikes. In both cases, there would be a Machloikes. Zok to Gemara, no, you don't necessarily have a raya, because maybe we have to partage this brisa we just learned of Nirin a little bit different. Hachikam, Amar Rebbe, Nirin devarai lechaveirai kishemachra lechavlo umanu tzarif Yisrael. Maybe what Rebbe means to say is even the Chachamim are moided to me. Even the Chachamim are moided to me if it was sold to a Yid. So that means Rebbe is saying the Rabbanon only say their halacha if it was sold to a Goy, because the Rabbanon would agree with me that if it was sold to a Yid, that Avoda, it would be bottle. Even the Chachamim who say loy bitel, they didn't argue with me. Only if you sold it to a Goy. Or if they sold it to be destroyed, moiduli. So let's break this down. Now what we're saying is that machloikis is only if you sold it to a Goy. If you sold it to a Goy, that's where there would be a machloikis where the Rabban holds it loy bittul. But if you sold it to a Yid, for sure it wouldn't be bottled. So that would be similar to the first pshat that we had in this Gemara, which was the Chad Amar machloikis b'tzorif ovid gechavim. If it was sold to a Goy, that's where there's a machloikis of b'tzorif Yisrael divra kol bitel. But you don't have a raya about the second shita if the second shita is saying that they're arguing by both or only by Yisrael. Okay, Kabaltik. Zog Gemara Meisvei. Gemara has a kasha. Halakech grew toys mina oivdik gechavim. You have a scrap metal dealer, and he buys, Rashi says, shavorik sof, broken pieces of silver he would buy from Goy, from Oidev Avodah. So he has now a big basket full of, he probably bought it by weight, and he bought a box full of silver pieces. As he looked through the silver, he saw a little getchka inside. There was a little piece of Avodah Zarah. Now the question is, that's like a hot potato, because if the Yid gets stuck with the Avodah Zarah, he's out whatever that value was. Whatever it weighed, whatever he paid for it, he's out, because a Yid's Avodah Zarah can never become bottom. So now the whole question is, whose Avodah Zarah is it? So Zok de Braise, Im Achaloi Nasan Mois Moshach, if he already made a Meshicha, he took the whole box and he lifted up and he took it to himself, the box of silver, but he had not yet paid. Yachzir, he could still give it back and reverse the sale. Why is that, Zok Rashi? Let him give it back to the Goy. The Goy could have been a bottle of Avodah Zarah and then resell it to the Yid. And afterwards, once the Goy is a bottle of Avodah Zarah, now it's free and clear, the Yid can buy it. Zok Rashi, how could you say you can give it back? He made a kinyan Mashiach on it already. Even though the Yid already made a Mashiach on this pile of silver, you don't say that this getchka belongs to the Yid. The Eina B'Tela. Let me see what the Ches says. Ches says, Ve'eina B'Tela. Well, he just suggests look at another Gemara. Why? Because the Mashiach b'tois havoy. Clearly, when the Yid made the Mashiach, he had absolutely no intention of buying a getchke. The lo yoda sheyesh ben avodas kachavim. So since the Mashiach is b'tos, we could reverse this entire sale. The guy could be mevatel avodah zara, and the Yid could buy it from him then. However, if he first paid and then he made Mashiach, that's his. That's no longer a reversible Mashiach. That's not a Mashiach b'tos. What he has to do is whatever the value of that getchke is, or the getchke itself, he has to take it and destroy it. He's not allowed to have a no from it, as we learned yesterday, ton geniza. So let's have a look at Rashi. Then yoylech hanol yam melech. He can't return the getchke and be refunded the amount of money that he paid for it. The Avoda the Mashiach. You might ask, just like before, it was a Mashiach b'tois here as well. Even the Yav Dami, if he paid already, technically there's no issue whatsoever. This was a toes, he can give it back. But the problem is somebody watching is going to see that he is giving avodah zara to a goy, and the goy is paying him. It's literally going to look like he's selling avodah zara. So it's midrabanan. We don't allow him to give it back. Why? Because the goy, people will think that he's selling an avodah zara to a goy. But the problem here is if the goy sold this avodah zara, that means, and the goy sold it to a yid. Didn't we say that if a goy sells it to a yid, the assumption is that the goy is being mevatlet, right? That's what we just brought a raya to. That's how we explain the last thing. Livid dvari lechavera k'shemracha lechavlo umanu tzarif Yisrael. She'af chavera lenechlaku alai. We just said that the chachamim would be moida that if a goy sells a getchke to a yid, he's for sure mevatlet. Well, here's a case of a goy who sells a getchke to a yid, and yet we say it's not bottle because the yid stuck with an avodah zara and it's yoylech liyam melech. So Rashi, alma afal gav the zamen ovet lechavim liyisrael katani asura the loy botla. So this is a stira to the way we just explained the machlokes Rabbi and the chachamim. Zok Gemara, this is not comparable at all to the case of our Mishnah. So Zok Gemara, I amrit b'shleimer b'tzarif Yisrael machlokes. If you'll learn at least that there's a machlokes b'tzarif Yisrael, because here the guy is selling it to a tzarif Yisrael, and there's somebody who holds that it's also in Hamani Rabbanani. We'll say this is going according to Rabbanan, who hold that even if a guy sells the getchke to a yid, he's not mavakli. But if you learn, like we just concluded, that the machlokes between Rabbi and the Chachamim is only if it's sold to a goy, and only there do the Rabbanan hold loy bitlay. But if the guy sold it to a yid, divrei kol bitel, the fact that he's selling it to a yid shows that he's being mevatel d'avodah zara. Hamani, who is going to be the author of this brayso of a lekach grutois? There's no comparison. Shiny Hosam that died the Grutoyis Zovin, I died the Zovin. The guy didn't even know there was a getchke there. If the guy consciously sells a getchke to a yid, yes, there everybody agrees that he's being mevatlet. He's selling it to a yid, he's going to be mevatlet. But here it was a big pile of silver nuggets. The guy didn't know there was a getchke in there, and he just sold it as a group. That doesn't constitute a bittul, because the guy doesn't even realize that he's selling it to a guy, that he's selling it to a yid. And therefore, it's still osebana. Let's have a look at Rashi. Shiny Hosam, the high Ovid Gechavim, Adaited Avoidis Gechavim Loy Zomen. Here for sure he didn't sell it out to Getchke. Why? Because Lo Yoda Sheyeshem Avoidis Gechavim. The guy didn't even realize that in this box of silver pieces there was a little Getchke there. Aval Heicha the Zoven Avoidis Gechavim Levada L'Tzarif Yisrael. But if he's selling a Getchke by itself, meaning he's very conscious of the fact that he's selling a Getchke, there divrei koil bitla midaitai. That would be an indication that he's being mevatel this avodah zara. Beautiful. Zok the heilige Gemara vayter. Tanu Rabban. Lova olaha. What if a guy had a valuable getchke and he borrowed money using the getchke as collateral, which is similar to our Mishnah's case, a mishkanoi. Or a big wall crashed down and fell on top of the avodah zara. The avodah zara is buried in rubble, and we don't see that the goy is taking any step to unearth it and to dig it up. So that's again somewhat of a display of a not caring about the avodah zara. Or sure gadvu listed. or if listim steal it and he doesn't seem to be making an effort to retrieve it, or the owner moved away. They moved away overseas and they left the getchkula there. That's clearly not indication that they want to keep this avodah zarah. Turning on Talmud base, im asidin. Oh, I think I just lost my camera, so let me just read it. Im asidin lachser, if they're going to be coming back. There is the focus. Kimel chemesh Yeshua. Should focus eventually. Oh, plug it. I'll plug it in again. The technology is fabulous when it works. It's a little bit better. Imasidin lachser. Imasidin lachser. Kimolchemes Yeshua. If they're going to eventually come back from their trip, like the Melchemes Yeshua, we'll see what all this means. Eino b'tela. And the simple logic is, if the guy is intending to return, he's not abandoning the avodah zarah. So therefore, the avodah zarah remains in force. Rashi of the Bach sticks in, Eina b'tela ilamis. It'll never be bought. So before we get into the Yeshua business, because Rashi right away points out, L'kamei parach, halei emeriyim sheyotu lilachem im Yeshua. What does it mean if they're going to return from battle like Melchemes Yeshua? Yeshua won the Melchama. Nobody returned from battle. So by saying if they return like they returned by Yeshua nobody returned. They all got wiped out by the Eden. So we're going to have to see what that means. But let's just analyze the first part of the Brisa. Utricha. The Gemara, the Mishnah, the Brisa lists off 4 or 5 examples of things that could be a bittul. Lending money, borrowing money against it, or if it's covered by rubble. Why do we need so many examples of things that indicate that the goy is being mabatal avodah zarah? Zok Gemara utricha. Itana lava alel. If the only example of bittul is lava alel, where the Bride says it's not mavatalit, midaloi zavna loy batla. There, I would say the reason why the Bride says that lending on it, borrowing money on it, is not a bittul is because since you didn't sell it, you're just lending it out. You're still showing you're trying to hold on to it. Avol nafla alem apoilis. But you would have thought that if a pile of rubble falls on it and I'm not working to dig it up, midaloi kamafnala. Since I'm not actively trying to dig it up, not michas from the goy, ema bitule batla, maybe that would be an expression of bittul. Tricha, we need the brayso to specifically list that case of nafla lemapoilis, that it's not an indication of bittul. And v'itan nafla lemapoilis, that's mishum desover hamancha. The reason why he's not digging it up is hamanchas. It's there, it's safe. Kol emes to be inala shakilnala. The next time I need my getchkula, I'll dig it up, but it's there. I don't need to. So the fact that I'm not dealing with it right now, that the guy is not dealing with it right now, is not an indication of bittul. I will convul listim, but if listim stole it from this guy and the guy is not actively pursuing them, midaloi k'mahadra basra, surely bittul lebatla. Therefore, tricha. So basically, each of the examples of bittul that the Brayso says is not a bittul is a buildup from a smaller chiddush to the biggest chiddush, that even if listim took it and he's not pursuing them, that's also not called a bittul. V'itana ganvu listin mishum desavar mimanashin. If the guy took it, a guy took it, maflech palachla. I'm not pursuing it, but whoever stole it is continuing to use this getchke that he stole from me as an avodah zarah. So that's not a bittul. Right, we already learned he could be miyayish on never getting it back, but that doesn't mean he's being mevatel from it being of an avodah zarah. And Yisrael shakla, and if it was a gangster, a yid who took it, I need the damer yikarin, since it's a very expensive item, it's a silver statue. Maz bin lo lavid gechavim upalachla. The yid's not going to melt it down. The yid's going to sell it to another guy, and that guy is going to buy it as a getchka, and therefore it's still not a bittul. Medina Sayom. But if they completely abandoned this Getchke and they moved overseas, if they didn't take their beloved Getchke with them, Bitula Batlua, that for sure is a bittul. And again, Dr. Bryce, it's not Tricha. Okay, so that's why the Bryce is a build-up. All these cases, one is a bigger chiddush than the next, because in each one you would think that maybe this is not considered this is considered a bittul. Kamash will understand. Now let's go back to what the Bryce says. Imasidin lachser kemilchamish Yeshua. So zok the Gemara. Imasidin lachser kemilchamish Yeshua eino b'teil. Frag the Gemara. Midi milchamish Yeshua mahader hader. They didn't come back from the milchamish Yeshua. So what is the Bryce telling us? Zok the Gemara hachika amar. This is what the Bryce means to say. Imasidin lachser. If their intent is to go to battle and then come back triumphant and return to their land and to their getchkes, then harehu k'melchemes Yeshua, it'll be just like melchemes Yeshua, where when they went to fight, when the Mayrim came to fight Klal Yisrael, they also thought they were going to be triumphant. They also thought that they were going to win. So they surely were not mebatel their avodah zaros when they left to go to battle. And that's why when Klal Yisrael came in to Eretz Yisrael after they conquered the Mayrim, all of the getchkes that they found were usher, because even though the goyim came to battle and never came back, but when they left with the full intention of coming back. So they were never mevatel their avodah zaros when they left the battle, and therefore the ein lo b'teila. Zok Rashi, the second line from the top. If they intend to come back, meaning they're not being mevatel their avodah zaros, they're not abandoning their avodah zaros, they're going to battle, they'll be back. Hareyu asura. Just like the getchkes that the Yidden found that belonged to the Marim, they thought they were going to win. They thought they were going to return. That's why their avodah zaros are also banach, because when they left, they were not about them. You're not allowed to have a bit of anah from the avodah zarah. I find it very interesting. When Yidden go to battle, who goes in front? The Rebbeinu Shloim, the Oren goes in front. But when the Goyim go to battle, we better leave the Getchke home. They should be safe, and we'll go fight. That's quite a vote of confidence in their Getchke. We better leave them at home for safekeeping. So that's all the Brisa means when the Brisa draws a comparison to the Melchemes Yeshua, that if the psyche of the Goyim when they leave are to return, that's not a bit. If their intention is never to return, that would be a bit. So Zok to Gemara, it would have been so much easier just to say if they intend to return or not. Why do we need to mix in the Melchemes Yeshua here? Zok to V'lamali limitalia b'Melchemes Yeshua. Why did the Tana need to throw in a reference to the Melchemes Yeshua? Zok to Gemara milsa agav urcha kamashmalam. The Tana likes to densely pack his words with chedushim, and as an aside, we're going to learn an extra halacha from here that wasn't the direct focus of what the Tana was saying. And Rashi tells us that this seems to be a pattern. Zok Rashi milsa agav urcha kamash malon, which is the third skinny line in Rashi. Lefi darkoi, the derech of the Tana, shal yitzarech lelamdenu shaloi botol, while he was telling us that the getchke is not botol if they intend to return when they're leaving. He also hinted to us another important piece of information. Nosan simin ledvarav lilamdenu, to teach us mitoich simin by referencing Yeshua. He's on the side adding another tidbit of information, milsa achrisi, and that is l'siyuya l'Rav Yehuda, to bring a right to Rav Yehuda that we're going to learn in a moment. Dami Yisrael shezakav l'vein. So there'll be an extra tidbit of halacha that we learn, even though that's not the central focus of this brisa. So Zok to Gemara, what is that? Now we learned that, at least according to Rabbi Kiva, a yid that makes an avodah zarah, but he has not yet served it, that avodah zarah is not asher bano. Once he serves it, it's asher bano. What happens if a yid prepares an avodah zarah, he does not serve it, but a goy comes along and serves it? Would that be asher bano or not? Could the goy make my thing asher bana? Normally, ain't adam oiser davar shein shaloi. But here, I've already prepared it as an avodah zarah. Would that become an avodah zarah with the goy serving? So that's what Rabbi Yehuda talks about. Kihad Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rab Yisrael shezokaf leveinu l'shtacha b'isla. A yid took a block. It's a rectangular shaped block, so he stood it up, made it look like a little tombstone. Now there's something to bow down to, but he didn't bow down to it. And the guy came and bowed down to it. He says, hey, this looks like a good getchker. I think I'm going to bow down to it. Also, the guy answers it. Well, how does the guy answer it? It doesn't belong to the guy. Because the teretz is, we're going to soon see in the Gemara, it's because clearly the Yid is very maskim to the guy bowing down to it. The Haraya, the Yid is the one who set it up. Where do you see this concept? You see this concept exactly by the case of Yeshua and the Miriam. Minol and the Asra. How do you know that it's Asra? Omar Abalazar, Kitchila Shel Eretz Yisrael. That's exactly what occurred when we first went into Eretz Yisrael with Yeshua. The Omar Achmana. What does the Torah tell us? What are you supposed to do when you get into Eretz Yisrael? V'asheirayim tisrafun beis. Burn their asheiros because they made all these trees into Israel. No, they made them into the Avodah Zarah. The problem is, how could they make our trees into Avodah Zarah? Michti, Yerusha hi lahem me'avasayim. We already were given the land from way back before, from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So just because the Goyim are occupying our land, the Goyim are the occupiers. Just because they've been occupying our land until now, that doesn't give them ownership of it. So ein adam oiser, ve'ein adam oiser davar shein shaloi. So they were serving as avodah zarah, they were bowing down to trees. That shouldn't answer the trees because they don't have the ability to answer our trees. Now, the imishom hanach meikara, and if the asherim that the Torah is telling you have to be burnt are not asheris that started to be served by goyim after HaKadosh Baruch Hu had already given the land to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but maybe these are asheris that predate Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and at that point the land did belong to the goyim, and they were able to answer it. Then bibitula ba'al masagi lahu. So then you could just get the goy to be mevatel. It's not an avodah zarah shel Yisrael. It's an avodah zarah shel goy. Let him be mevatel.
Yosy,
yes.
They weren't given the land. They were promised the land to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but they weren't given the land. And Vaharaya, that by light, when he allowed his sheep to eat everywhere, the Ray Avram said, "No, you can't, because now it belongs to the Canaanim." It was for the future. It was promised.
I was thinking that as well, and it's a little bit difficult. Let's see if Rashi shed some light in. I was wondering the same thing. It was promised to them, but it wasn't given to them until they came into Israel.
That's right.
If anything, there's a shiloh was given to Yosy Mitzrayim or to Boy Aretz, but that's all way later after Mitzrayim.
If that were true, the Raya Light had an argument.
They would have been able to say it's ours already.
Yeah.
And let's see what it says about Shrem Tishrun Alma Ilanis Tami Asiri Umichti Haaretz V'Chol HaMechubela Yerusha LiYisrael Hi Me'avoseim Tarei Lavrom Nemer Kilecha Tenena. It's funny. Etnena means I will give it to you in the future. It doesn't even say Kilecha Nasno. It says Kilecha Tenena, which supports what Rav David is saying. The Goyim Shabo Acher Lo Yochel L'Asher B'Shtachava. Right? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't even say I'm giving it to you. He said I'm going to give it to you. So I don't know. Let me see if the Mesivta says anything about this. Let's just see if he said anything about this. No, he doesn't have any. There's not even like a letter to indicate he's shunting around the whole issue. Okay, so this is going to need. I have to listen to Rabbi Rosner share on this because he probably will have what to say about this. But it's like a very interesting aura. It was promised to Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, but it wasn't given to them. Ella, it must be midapochu, unless if it was given to the Yosy Mitzrayim, which would have been 40 years before Yeshua took them into Eretz Yisrael, maybe that's what the Gemara is talking about. How were they able to aser the Asheros for the last 40 years? then it was ours already. If you hold it was given to the Yosy Mitzrayim. So the Gemara says, Elamai, the Asheris that were served before the Yosy Mitzrayim, before it was given to us. Whatever the Gemara is saying is, the Klal Yisrael took ownership of Eretz Yisrael before they actually stepped foot into it.
Well, there's the Gemara talks about kivush a lot. The kivush Eretz Yisrael, the conquest. This is how they make a chazak on the land.
But even though that's the conquest, it's considered there's a Yerusha, right? We say that the Yerusha came from the Yosy Mitzrayim. Now we know for sure the Yerusha came from the Yosy Mitzrayim. The question was it given to the Boy Aretz and then went back? It was a complicated arrangement. And then it went back. Lemafreya went back to the grandfathers and they came back down to them.
Yeah, once it's conquered, that's how it works. But before it's conquered.
But how could they yarshin it from the Yosy Mitzrayim if at that point by the Yosy Mitzrayim it wasn't conquered yet? So there must be different levels of ownership.
Maybe.
So Zok Gemara, what about the Asheris that were there even before the Yidden took ownership of the land? Just forced to go in to be mevatlit. Yet the Torah says it's usher. Why is it usher? You know why? Since in the Midbar, Klal Yisrael did do Avodah Zara, Galu adatayu the nichalahu ba'avodas kachavim. By them being over the egel, Rechman Litzlan, it shows that they were maskim to all the getchkas everywhere, and that means they're giving haskama to the fact that the goyim were serving asheris in their future land, which is exactly the case of a yid who sets up a matzeva, but didn't bow down to it. But that shows that he's maskim to make it into Avodah Zara. Now the goy can make it into an Avodah Zara. So in the case of Rabbi Yehuda, the haskama was shown by the fact that the yid set up the block. In the asheris in Eretz Yisrael, the haskama was shown by the fact that the yidden themselves did the egel. And therefore, we look at him like they're doing a shlichus of the yid, and as Rashi says, Hilchach havya avodas kachavim shel Yisrael ve'ena betela olamus. That's why these asheris have to be destroyed. So therefore, by the same token that the asheris were usher when they came into Eretz Yisrael, Hakanami Yisrael shazakaf levena gali daite, that's expressing that he maskim the nichale ba'avodas kachavim, and therefore v'chiasa ovid kachavim upalachla shlichusa didei kavod. Frank the Gemara, how do you see that just because the Yidden deemed the egel, they're complicit in an asherah that's in Eretz Yisrael? They were just serving the egel. Where do you see they were serving other avodah zaros? But Mamidach we know loy. Zok Gemara, no. Amar Kra, what did the Yidden say? They said Ela Eloi Hecha Yisrael. B'loshen Rabbim. Not this is your getchka. This is one of the many getchkas. Meaning they were showing that they were complicit in all the getchkas. Melamed she'ivui la'aloyos harbe. They were putting themselves under the control of many different getchkas, even those that were in Eretz Yisrael. Zok to Gemara, maybe Ema called the Bahada Egel Nitzru Mikan ve'elech Nishtari. How do you know that forever and ever afterwards, anyone who does a Nashera, they're masking to? Maybe at that moment in time, at that snapshot in time, at the beginning of their deal in the Midbar, those Asheris are also, because at that moment they were masking. But an hour later, after they did tshuva, after the Egel was destroyed, so they're no longer masking. So any Asheris that the Goyim would have established during the 40 years in the Midbar after the Ma'is of the Egel, that they weren't masking to. Why do those have to be burned? So they don't have to be burned. Go find him. How are you going to know when a guy is serving a tree? How are you going to know when he was over it? And therefore, we have to aser all the asheris, and they all need to be burned. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. Avodas kachavim shehini chua oivdel b'shas sholei. It was not a time of war. It was a time of peace. There was no pressing reason for them to run. Muteris, it'll become muter. You know why? Because they're not coming back. Because if they're rushing in a war, just grabbing their basic necessities, but they're hoping to come back one day, that wouldn't be bittul. But if they're moving and they leave it behind, clearly that's something that they're not interested in. But the Shas Melchama Asura. Bimu Siyosh Shal Malachim. Bimu Siyosh Shal Malachim are stone bases that they would set up in the path of travel of kings, because when the king would stop by on his way past these little stations, they would put getchkas on these stands so that the king could bow down to the getchkas as he's traveling. So hare elu mutares. Those are mutar. They don't become ashabana. Mipnei shamidin oisa b'shas she'hamalachim oivrin, because they put them with the malachim travel. So that's why they're mutar. We're going to have to see what that means. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rab. Beis Nimrod, the house of Nimrod, which Rashi says, it's the tower that the Dar Haflaga built, La Avoda Zara, and we refer to as Beis Nimrod because he was the king at the time. Beis Nimrod Harei Kavodas Kechavim Shehinichu Avda B'Shash Shalom. There was a whole confusion that made everybody fall apart. True, but there was no war there, and therefore we consider it like they left B'Shash Shalom, and it's abandoned, it's bottled, it's no longer an Avodah Zarah, umutter, and therefore would be mutter. I think it was called the Tower of Babylon. Avagav dechi badrinu rachmona kishas melchamadami. Even though when they all scattered, it was a time of great confusion, but nevertheless, iboilam aheder, if they wanted to come back, they could have. They could have. Hadar, they could have come back, and they didn't. Midaloi hadar, betula batla, it shows that they are mavatled, and that's why it's not ashabani. Bimu siyah shal malachim hare elu mutaris. Why is that a justification for them not being usher? So they set them up to put getchkes on top of them when kings were going by. So it's a getchke to place the house of the Avodah Zarah. Why should that not be a reason to usher? This is what the Mishnah means to say. And the malachim are not interested. The kings are not interested in bowing down to their getchkes. Umalachim manichim derech zu v'hoichim derech acheres. And the kings go a completely different way. In other words, so they don't become avodah zarah. There's a little bit of a shaila how to understand this. So Rashi says umalachim derech acheres vein choshen lehem. The kings ignore those bases. They're not interested. Hilchach lav misham she'avodah chacham. They're not misham she'avodah chacham, because even though they were set up originally for that, since the king doesn't go use it, the goyim already who set it up were mavatal it from making it prepared for an avodah zarah, or it's a mishamish that was never used. As we learned, everyone agrees that a mishamish of the chum has to be used before it becomes osir, because it's asher abdu shamagoy. Kiyasa ula, when ula came, Yosef abimtza pegima. There was one of these pedestals that was used for avodah zarah. It was a little bit cracked, and ula sat on it, meaning he had a gnaw from it. How could you do that? Both Rav and Shmuel agree that Bima Shanifkam, if it's a pedestal that was made to hold Avodah Zarah and they got cracked, still osir. It's still osir to have a gnaw from. And even if you hold that an Avodah Zarah itself that's broken, nobody would serve, and that would be bottled. The zila be milsa lemivlach l'shvarim. That's only the getchke itself, because a guy is not going to lower his dignity to worship a broken piece of getchke. But the pedestal doesn't bother him with a little crack. He'll still put a getchke on it, so therefore it should remain aser. So Ula answered back, "Oy, the Heilige Rav and Shmuel, man yoiv lo me'afra the Rav and Shmuel umali'inan einin. Who would give us the earth of the caver of Rav and Shmuel? We should put it on their eyes. Let's covet to show covet for Rav and Shmuel. They were so great, and they're talking great. But you know what? There are those who argue on Rav and Shmuel. Harabi Yochanan Rish Lakish Amit Havayu Bima Shenivkam is mutter. So I have Rav Yochanan and Rish Lakish to be Saimich upon. Va'afilu Lamanda Omar. Even if you hold Oivdin L'Shvarim, even those who hold that a getchke itself that was broken, they would serve. Hanamili Avodah Kechavim. That's Dafka Goy. Like even the Polcha, once the Goy already serves this Avodah Zarah, Zila Bei Milsa Levatula. He's not going to abandon it because it's broken. It's already his getchke. He's not going to abandon it. He'll have a little loyalty. Avol Hani, but if it's just a pedestal that's broken, Shokli Lahai, Umaisi Bimashachrina. The getchke you can't replace. But the pedestal you can easily replace. So for sure, once it's cracked, they have no intention ever of using it for Avodah Zarah anymore, and therefore it's going to be bought. And that's why Ula felt comfortable resting on this cracked bimos.
Even if it wasn't never used for Avodah Zarah,
It wouldn't be usher. It wouldn't be usher because we learned yesterday that it says
So we assume that it was used.
correct.
How
Yeah,
did it happen?
that's right. That's right. We have a brajah to support the fact that the bimus that's damaged is no longer usher. Because it says bimus shenifkam mutter. That's pretty clear. Mizbeach shenifkam is usher, but a mizbeach that was nifkam is usher ad sheyinatetz ruboy. So a bimus with a little crack won't be used anymore. But a mizbeach with a little crack would be continue to be used, and until it's roiv destroyed, it remains usher bana. It looks like a little platform. How do you know if it was a mizbeach where it has to be roiv destroyed to discharge it, or if it's a bimus where a small crack will discharge it? Very simple. Bimus is evanachas. These pedestals were made out of one big stone, so that's how you know that if it's a small crack in one big stone, we could discharge and it won't be a problem with Israel. No, but mizbeach is avonim harbe. So if you have a platform made out of many stones, the assumption is a mizbeach until it's roiv destroyed, we would not be able to have enough from it. Gevalti. Amar Chizkiya, how do you see this in the psukim that this is how a mizbeach is made? Mikra, it says besumai. Let me read this from inside the pasuk. L'chein bezois yichaper avon Yaakov. This is how we'll have a kapara. V'zeh kol pri. V'zeh kol pri. Haser chatasai to take away zavera. B'soimai kol avne mizbeach ka'avne germenu b'alteis. When the stones of the mizbeach will be scattered around like dirt, that's when we'll say lo yukumun asher v'chamonim. If it's totally spread around, then the mizbech is bottled and no longer osmana. But ilav, if it's not totally scattered around, meaning it's not destroyed, at least roiv of it, liyakumu, they remain the iser as avodah zarah. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we were zeichen to finish Daf Nun Gimel. Tomorrow we will learn Daf Nun Dal Bez Hashem.
Go ahead.